Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today I'll be taking you through the Writing and Language section of SAT Practice Test 6. I'll be showing you how to approach the Writing and Language section of SAT, and I'll be giving you my tips, tricks, and advice on how to define the type of question you are being asked and use that to eliminate wrong answer choices. And I'll also teach you how to use grammar rules and apply them in order to find the correct answer. Now let's begin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the passage, and then as we approach a question, I'll show you what I look for, and then I'll show you what I see as the question type, and then I'll take you through the correct answer and how to get there. So we'll go ahead and start with number 1, a necessary resource for science. In the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227. This is one. Well, when I read this, I see Lake 227, right? And I see this is one of. Well, I don't want to say this is one. I just said Lake 227, so I can get rid of this is, put a comma there, and just say one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. And here's why that works. When we do that, we create our dependent clause here, which I'm going to put as DC, and we separate that from our independent clause with this comma. If we were to not put a comma here, right, and we put a period, like in C and B, we would have to have an independent clause follow that period. But what we see is we have which is one. That doesn't create an independent clause, right? That would create another dependent clause, and we can't have a dependent clause be a sentence. So that would show us that B would be out. And if we started with one, well, that would also be a dependent clause. So we can't use a period there either. And if we look in A, we have another independent clause. We would have an independent clause if we just left this is in, right? If we have this is, that creates an independent clause, which would mean we'd have a comma splice because we'd have two independent clauses separated by a comma with no fanboy there. So we know we can't have A. So therefore we know our answer has to be D. Next, Schindler and Brunskill were contaminating the water not out of malice but in the name of research. While deliberately adding chemical compounds to a lake may seem destructive and irresponsible, so I know that's my dependent clause, this method of experimenting is sometimes the most effective way to influence policy and save the environment from even more damaging pollution. Alright, well I see I have my dependent clause, independent clause here. They're separated by a comma, so I know that that right there is going to be my answer. And if I look at my other choices, I would see in B, we split destructive and irresponsible with a comma, which isn't necessary because it's a list of two, so there's no comma that needs to be there. In C, we put a comma after and between destructive and responsible. That doesn't need to be there because there's only two in that list, right? And even if there did need to be one, it would be here, not there. So we know C's out, and then when we look at D, we see that we would have no independent clause because this method has that comma after it, right? And we need that comma to go before it because this method is what creates our independent clause, right? So we know D has to be out as well. Okay, we have of experimenting is sometimes the most effective way to influence policy and save the environment from even more pollution. Schindler and Brunskill were investigating possible causes for the large blooms of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria that had been affecting bodies of water such as Lake Erie. In addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion. Oxygen depletion kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. Well, as I read this, I see I have two sentences separated by a period. When I see that, they're all underlined. They're probably going to be asking me to combine them, which they are in this case. And then the other thing that jumps out to me is I see oxygen depletion here at the end of a sentence with a period and here. Now, anytime I see that with like a word at the end of one sentence and starting that next sentence with that same word, what I'm going to look to do is combine the sentences, get rid of that second word, and then put a comma at the end of that first sentence, and then use either which, or if it's a person, who, or if it's a time, when. I mean, look to use one of those to combine the sentences. So I see cause oxygen depletion, which kills fish. So I will use a comma and then do which kills fish. So that's going to be my guess on what the answer choice is going to be here. And now whenever I'm looking at my answer choices for combining underlined sentences, I'm going smallest to largest, right? So I start with D, which is only 3 lines, and then I go from the smallest one, so the next smallest would be A, and then B and C. It doesn't really matter the order there. After I do the smallest to large, if any are the same, I just go down. So starting with D, I have, in addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, which kills fish and other wildlife in lakes, which is what I had. It's efficient in its word choice, it's not repetitive or redundant, and that'll be our answer. Just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green. It was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. Alright, so let's see what our question is there. So right here, we're looking at either combining the sentences. It's not explicitly stating we have to, but it's always a possibility. So we're really just looking at punctuation, right? They want you to know your grammar. That's kind of what this is asking. So if we look at this, we have just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227, so that's our subject, turned bright green, right? So we have that as our independent clause there. Now we have another independent clause. It was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. Well, we can't have a period and then it was thick with and then a colon, right? Because it was thick with isn't in the independent clause. The independent clause is this whole part here, right? So we can't split it there, so we know no change is out. Now if we look at choice B, we have the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, and then we have a colon, it was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. And that's going to be our answer, and here's why. Our independent clause, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, is followed by our explanation in our example that illustrates the idea that precedes it, right? We're explaining our idea that precedes it. We're explaining how the water in Lake 227 turned bright green. And when we're explaining the idea preceding it, and we have two independent clauses, right? So we have an independent clause, a colon, an independent clause, and our second one is explaining our first one. We use a colon to separate them. So our answer there is going to be B. Question 5. Which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to this one? Well, in order to do that, we need to know what our paragraph is saying in our next one. So we're going to start here. We have the scientists divided the lake in half by placing a nylon barrier through the narrowest part of its figure 8 shape. In one half of Lake 226, well, that's a giveaway. Before we were talking about Lake 227, and if you scroll up on your PDF, you'll see that, and I'll quickly do that here just to show you. See, we have Lake 227. Now we're talking about 226, so we need to switch from 227 to 226 in our intro. So we're looking for one that says 226. I see C does, so I go ahead and read that just to make sure. To isolate the cause of the algae, Schindler and Brunskill performed another experiment, this time using Lake 226, and then it says the scientists divided the lake in half, so I know that'll be my answer. Now I've got question 6. They added phosphates, nitrates, and a source of carbon in the other. They added just nitrates, and a source of carbon was added. Well, we already have they added, so we don't need what it was added again, right? So we'll just have and a source of carbon. And then plus also, that is redundant, repetitive, not efficient. And then but also adding, we already said they're adding, so we don't want that. Schindler and Brunskill hypothesized that phosphates were responsible for the growth of cyanobacteria. The experiment confirmed their suspicions when half of the lake containing the phosphates was teeming with blue-green algae. Alright. Well, I have underlined word, middle of the sentence, so all I'm doing is looking at if there needs to be changes. If not, I hit no change. If there does need to be changes, then I look at that. So I'm just kind of checking for grammar here, tenses, all of that. So I have my subject, half of the lake, containing the phosphates was teeming. Well, I know half of the lake's singular, so I know my verb here has to be singular. It's non-possessive, right? And it also has to be past tense, right? Because we're talking past tense throughout our whole paragraph, right? We have hypothesized, right? So that's past tense, so I know it has to be singular past tense verb. Alright, so what's my singular past tense verb? It is was teeming, right? That's singular and past tense, so I know A will be my answer. Were would be plural, so I know that one's out. And then we have teams, which would be present, not past. And then we have are teeming, which is also not past tense. So my answer there is going to be A. Schindler and Brunskill's findings were shown off by the journal Science. Well, shown off by is not a good way to say it, right? That's kind of not academic, right? And this is an academic article. So when we're doing an academic article, we want all our words to be academic. Shown off by is not, right? That's kind of something you'd say to your friend. Or say if you were at like a 5th grade talent show, right? So we can go ahead and say no change is wrong. Put in the spotlight of, that's not efficient. We want to be efficient in our word choice, right? We want to say things with a purpose. And then we have published in versus put into. Put into is too basic, it's not academic, but published in is, and it's showing us how these findings by the scientists are published in a journal of science, which is the correct relationship there, right? Anything that has findings is published in, right? It's not put into. All right. The research demonstrated a clear correlation between introducing phosphates and the growth of blue-green algae. For example, legislators in Canada passed laws, and when I see for example, just looking for a transition that's accurate, and for example isn't really accurate here because we're talking about legislators in Canada passing laws banning phosphates in laundry detergents which had been entering the water supply. That isn't an example of the research demonstrating a correlation, right? What are said here and here, sentence 9 is not an example of that. So we can go ahead and get rid of no change. But what it is it's not similar, and it's not contrasting however, right? But what it is it's saying what comes after. That's all we're doing here, is we're saying what came after this research was published is that legislators passed laws banning phosphates. It came after it, and therefore it was subsequently. All right, and then question 10. At this point, the writer wants to add a second policy outcome of the research described, which choice best accomplishes this goal. All right, so I'm just looking for anything that's stating a public policy. That's talking about phosphorus, right? So we have B. In the United States, many individual states have also adopted legislation to eliminate or at least reduce phosphorus content in laundry detergents. So that's a second policy in the United States, right? So I know my answer there is going to be B. Next, we have experiments like these can help people understand the unintended consequences of using certain household products. Which choice most effectively anticipates and addresses a relevant counter-argument? Okay, so we have to anticipate and address the counter-argument to the argument in favor of the types of experiments described in the passage. So we need to pay attention. We're not concerned about the actual law. We're concerned about the experiment done. All right. So we have, of course, regulating the use of certain chemical compounds can be a controversial issue. Well, that would be talking about not the experiment, but the law. We're talking about the experiment here, so we know no change is wrong. Now if we look at B, there's many companies now offer phosphate-free alternatives for household cleaning products. We're not worried about companies. We're not worried about legislation at all here. And then C, obviously scientists should not be allowed to randomly perform experiments on just any body of water. That's going to be our answer, because we're talking about a counter-argument to the types of experiments that were done. And then D, phosphates are sometimes used in agricultural fertilizers in addition to being used in cleaning products, and that has nothing to do with our type of experiment. Question 12 through 22 are based on the following passage. A little to the left, but not too much. Italy's Tower of Pisa has been leaning southward since the initial stages of its construction. Well, when I see its here, I know that that's the wrong its, because we're using possessive form is what we should be using, because it's the Tower of Pisa's, right? Tower of Pisa's, its construction. So it should be possessive. The possessive form of its has no apostrophe. So we can go ahead and get rid of A and B and C, and we're left with D. So we know D will be our answer there. Over 800 years ago. Indeed, if the tower's construction had not taken 2 centuries and involved significant breaks due to war and civil unrest, which allowed the ground beneath the tower to settle, the tower would likely have collapsed before it was completed. Alright, so here I see that I have one word, comma after it, beginning of the sentence, so I'm looking for a transition word. Well, what transition word makes sense here? Well, to know, we have to think about the sentence before it and the sentence that it is in. The sentence before it talks about how the Leaning Tower of Pisa has been leaning ever since it was constructed, and then our sentence after it talks about how the reason that it has been leaning ever since it was constructed, it gives us our reason due to war and civil unrest, right? So here, we're not contrasting anything, so we know we're not going to use however. We know that there is no causation, right? We're not saying that sentence 1 caused sentence 2, so we know we're not going to use therefore. And then sentence C, we know we're not going to use nevertheless, right? If we wanted to use therefore, our cause would have to be sentence 1 and our result would have to be sentence 2, right? But that we have the opposite, right? That's flipped. Result is in sentence 1 and cause is in sentence 2. So that's why therefore doesn't work, right? And then nevertheless would be if we were making a claim and then saying nevertheless something else happened, right? But we're not doing that. We're just saying since it's construction, it was leaning southward. Indeed, if it had not taken this long, maybe it would not have leaned southward, right? So our answer there is going to be A. Luckily, the tower survived and its tilt made it an Italian icon. Hang on, did we just skip? Okay, we did not. I just wanted to check and make sure we didn't skip an answer there. Luckily, the tower survived and its tilt has made it an Italian icon, attracting visitors, right? And here's why. I know immediately we have to get rid of it attracts, because I see this comma here, and I know we just read an independent clause, right? Independent clause, I'll do IDC, independent clause. And then I see we have another independent clause, because we have it attracts, right? That's a subject verb. So I know we're going to have another independent clause there. We can't connect two independent clauses with a comma. So I know no change is out. I know B is out. Now looking at, or I'm sorry, B is not out. If B had a subject here, then yes, it'd be out. Anything that has a comma and then a subject verb would be out, right? Because that'd be two independent clauses. So now looking at my answer choices, I know it has to be attracting after that comma, because then instead of an independent clause, we'll have a dependent clause, right? And we keep the meaning of the sentence the same. So I know that my answer there is going to be B, right? And if another thing, we know D is wrong, we have semicolon, but then we have attracting. We can't use a semicolon to split our independent clause from a dependent clause. It would have to be independent and independent. So we know D is out. Looking at C, we'd have it's attracting. Another independent clause. Also, it's the wrong it's. So two things there. So we know our answer there is going to be B. Alright. Attracting visitors from all over who flock to Pisa to see one of the world's greatest architectural weirdnesses. No, that's a terrible word choice here. Right, so we know A is going to be out. Deviations, that's also not a great word to show that it's an interesting architectural piece that differs from most architecture around the world, but yet it's loved by many, right? We want to capture that sense of people being amazed by it and that people love it even though it is a little bit out there, right? So now if we look at our answer choices, the word choice that best shows that it's different but yet still loved is oddities, right? And when we think about it, whenever people are using the word oddities, usually they're talking about something that they like even though it's very different, right? Abnormalities doesn't have that sense of people liking it, but oddities does. So we know our answer there is going to be C. Alright, question 16. Should the writer add the following sentence? Unfortunately, the tower's tilt has steadily increased over the centuries, placing the structure in danger of collapse. Well, in order to know if I should add that sentence, I need to know my sentence after it. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. So I have, by the late 20th century, the angle of the tower's tilt had reached an astonishing 5.5 degrees. In 1990, Italy's government closed the tower to visitors and appointed a committee to try to save it. Alright, well, would it make sense to say that the tower's tilt has increased over centuries before that sentence we just read? Yes, because in that sentence we read after it, it talks about how, as a result of the increase in tilt, they had to close it down, right? So we should add it. So we can get rid of our no's because we know we need to add it. Now we're left with our yeses. Well, why should we add it? Because it's leading into that next sentence, right? Is it providing an important restatement of the main claim in the previous sentence, or is it establishing an important shift in emphasis in the paragraph's discussion about the tower's tilt? Well, yes, it is providing an important shift in emphasis about the tilt of the tower, right? Because we're shifting from just saying that this tilt of the tower makes people intrigued by it to saying this tilt of the tower has required the government to close it, right? So we're shifting. We're not just restating a main claim. And we wouldn't want to include it if we were just restating something, right? Because we want to avoid restating things. So that's another red flag with answer choice A, right? So we know our answer there is going to be B. Question 17. We have in 1990, so we have the semicolon here, so we need to have an independent clause after the semicolon. We have in 1990 followed by a comma, right? That's correct. We need to have that comma there. And then we have Italy's government. Yep, the possessive in Italy's works. We have Italy's government. Close the tower. Yep, that all works. Everything's grammatically correct there. So I know that nothing's wrong there. That's going to be my answer. But I'll go ahead and show you why the other ones are wrong as well. In B, we have in 1990, Italy's government, comma, closed. We don't need a comma there. That one's unnecessary. We can just read through Italy's government as our subject, and then verb, closed. We don't need any comma there. Same thing in C, and also in C, we would need that comma after in 1990. Right, if we're giving a date like in 1990 at the beginning of a sentence or the beginning of our independent clause, right? Independent clause IC. We're going to need that comma after it, and then we can go ahead and get into government closed, right? The Italy's government closed. So we can go ahead and get rid of that one. And then if we look at in 1990, Italy's government closed, well then we'd have that semicolon, remember, back up top, where we have semicolon in 1990. We can't have a semicolon in 1990 and then a colon, right? That'd be completely grammatically incorrect. So we can go ahead and see why all those are wrong and A is correct. The committee was charged with saving the tower without ruining its aesthetic, which no one had yet managed to achieve. Alright, so I'm asked which choice best supports the main point of the paragraph, so I need to read on to find the main point. The committee's first attempt to reduce the angle of the tower's tilt, so they're trying to reduce our tower's tilt, placing 600 tons of iron ingots, molded piece of metal on the tower's north side to create a counterweight, was derided because the bulky weights ruined the tower's appearance. Alright, so we have our attempt to fix our tilt, and then the problem is that it ruins the tower's appearance. Then we're told they attempted a less visible solution, so we're concerned with our appearance. Sinking acres into the ground below the tower almost caused the tower to fall. Alright, so we see we're concerned with two things, fixing the tower's tilt, maintaining appearance as well. Alright, so that's our main point. So now we read through our answer choices. A, which no one had yet managed to achieve. That doesn't really support it. B, although not everyone agreed completely on what the aesthetic was. Nope. C, which meant somehow preserving the tower's tilt. That's one of the key points we made. While preventing that tilt from increasing. Yep. And toppling the tower. Yep. And then D, which included the pristine white marble finish that has come to be widely associated with the tower's beauty. No. We want C because it's talking about how we want to preserve the tower's tilt, which is what makes its iconic appearance, and then also preventing the tilt from increasing and toppling it over. Okay, so we know our answer there is going to be C. Now we move on. Alright, so we have a 1, so we know we're going to be asked a question about where a sentence has to go. So we go ahead and find what sentence we need to know. We see it's sentence 5, so we quick read that so we know where to place it. Berland advocated using soil extraction. Alright, so we want to place it by soil extraction, likely before that, right, because we're introducing it here. Removing small amounts of soil under the tower's north side, opposite its tilt, to enable gravity to straighten the tower. Okay, now we just go through, we read as normal, and subconsciously try to place it. Entered committee member John Berland. He is a geotechnical engineer. We don't need he is, right? We can just say comma, a geotechnical engineer, because by saying he is, that's pretty much the same as if we just replace that with John Berland, right? We don't want to say John Berland twice in a row, which is what we're doing by saying he is essentially. So we're going to go comma, and then say a geotechnical engineer from England who saved London's clock tower Big Ben from collapse. That way we avoid repetition and redundancy, and we're efficient. So we go ahead and find our answer choice here. It's going to be delete the underlined portion. Right, and also, if you're just looking at the other answer choices, we know A can't be right because then we would have subject he is verb, which would create an independent clause, and an independent clause connected by a comma. That's called a comma splice. You can't have that. So that's another way that we'd know A is wrong. Looking at B, we would also know that that's wrong because then we'd have another comma splice. Looking at C, also comma splice. So we know D would be our answer. And then sentence 2, Berland began a years-long process of drilling out small amounts of soil. Okay, so now we're talking about that soil, right? Well, when did we introduce that? We introduced that in sentence 5. So we know sentence 5 has to go between 1 and 2, because that's when we first learn about him introducing that idea. Now we're talking about him beginning that process. So we need to introduce the idea before we begin the process. We can go back down here, answer that one, placed after sentence 1. Alright, taking out small amounts of soil from under the tower that took several years to complete. We don't need that. We already have began a years-long process. So we don't need to add that part. We can just delete that. So our answer there is D. And then monitoring the tower's resulting movement. Twice daily, Berland evaluated these movements and made recommendations as to how much soil should be removed in the next drilling. By 2001, almost 77 tons of soil had been removed, and the tower's tilt had decreased by over 1.5 degrees. The ugly iron weights were removed, and the tower was reopened to visitors. Berland advocated using soil extraction. And we already placed that one, but we have to fix this part here. If it needs to be fixed, right? It's in the middle of a sentence, so we're just seeing if we have to replace it with something else, right? Or do no change. So let's go ahead and start with advocated, right? So that's our verb. We see that it's past tense because it's advocated, not advocates. Well, if we look at other past tense, we got to make sure we have Berland evaluated up here. So that's telling us we're in the right tense, right? We're past tense and past tense. So we know advocated is right, so we can go ahead and get rid of advocating, which is in D. Now we've got Berlin advocated using, or advocated to use, or the using of. Well, if we think about what's idiomatic, or which is what sounds right as we say it, what would we say if we were talking to someone? Would we say Berlin advocated using soil extraction, or would we say Berlin advocated the using of, right? The using of, no, we would never say that, right? And a lot of times on the writing section, it's about what you would say to someone. If you can figure out what you'd say to someone in a normal conversation or in an academic paper and fill in the blank, that's going to help you get to the right answer, right? So we know our answer here is A, because we have Berlin advocated using soil extraction, not advocating to use, right? We don't need to use that. We don't need the infinitive form like that, right? So our answer there is going to be A. And then question 22, we already answered, so we go ahead and move on. And we see that there aren't any more, so we don't even bother reading this whole paragraph. So now we can just go and get to questions 23 to 33. The physician assistant will see you now. The term paramedics refers to healthcare workers who provide routine and clinical services. Well, I'm asked for the best introduction to the paragraph, which means I need to read on to get my idea of what the paragraph is saying. While the pressures of an aging population, insurance reforms, and health epidemics have increased demand for care, the supply of physicians is not expected to keep pace. And as I read, I'm going to go ahead and answer that. It is not expected to maintain the tempo. That's not academic, and this is an academic article. So B is out, get in line, also not academic, and move along, also not academic. So I know my answer is A. Keep pace is the most academic of all of those. The Association of American Medical Colleges predicts a shortage of over 90,000 physicians by 2020. By 2025, that number could climb to more than 130,000. In some parts of the country, shortages are already a sad fact of life. A 2009 report by the Bureau of Health Professions notes that although a fifth of the U.S. population lives in rural areas, less than a tenth of U.S. physicians serves that population. So we're talking about a shortage of physicians. Because a traditional list response to the crisis, amping up medical college enrollments. So I'll go ahead and answer that one as well. So we have amping up medical college enrollments. Amping up is not very academic. We know that this is an academic article about a shortage of doctors, so we want to use academic language. Revving up is also not academic, neither is C. B, however, bolstering, right? That would be supporting medical college enrollments, increasing them, right? Bolstering them. That is academics. We know our answer there is going to be B. It fits with our tone and it's idiomatic. So our answer is going to be B. And expanding physician training programs is too slow and costly to address the near-term problem. Alternatives are being explored. One promising avenue has been greater reliance on PAs or physician assistants. All right, so what choice best introduces it? Well, A is definitely not, right? The term paramedics referring to the healthcare workers, we don't need to define that, right? We're not really talking about paramedics. We can get rid of A. B, for many Americans, finding a physician is likely to become a growing challenge. Yes, because we're talking about a shortage of physicians. So our answer there is going to be B. If we were to look at C, we know it's wrong because getting treatment for an illness usually requires seizing either a general practitioner or a specialist. We don't touch on specialists at all or general practitioners. We're just talking about the shortage of physicians. And then D, we're not talking about the cost of healthcare, right? So you know that one's out as well. All right, question 26. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Several factors argue in favor of such an expanded role. All right, so we're talking about expanded role for physicians. So we need to know if we're listing several factors before we decide if we should add it. All right, so we have by virtue of their medical training, PAs. So we're talking about PAs medical training. Well, PAs is plural, so we need a plural possessive pronoun because it's the PAs, it's their medical training. So plural and possessive pronoun their, which needs to be spelled T-H-E-I-R. So our answer there is going to be C. PAs perform many of the jobs traditionally done by doctors, including treating chronic and acute conditions, performing minor surgeries, this needs to be a comma, right? And prescribing some medications. That's a comma because we're doing a list, right? We have treating chronic and acute conditions, performing minor surgeries, comma, and prescribing some medications. It's a list of things, we need a comma there. So a comma after surgeries, but before and. So our answer there is going to be D. However, although well compensated, earning in 2012 a median annual salary of $90,930. Well, this is although well compensated. The comma would have to come after that compensated, right? And another thing is this. Our earning in 2012 a median annual salary of $90,930, that is non-essential, right? If we take that out and put any for non-essential, if we take that out, our sentence still makes sense, right? We have, however, although well compensated, PAs cost healthcare providers less than do the physicians, right? So our although well compensated, right? That's modifying or introducing our introductory modifying clause to our physician assistants, right? So we know we'll have to have a comma after that, but we also know we have a non-essential phrase, right? So there's a couple ways we can deal with that non-essential phrase. So let's see what our options are. All right, well, we see that we have although well compensated and then our comma after that, and then we have our non-essential phrase in parentheses, right? So that works because we can have a non-essential phrase be placed in parentheses, so that's a check. And we also have that comma then after compensated right here. So we know that B will be our answer. So now we move on, or we have to finish that sentence, I do believe. So we have PAs cost healthcare providers less than do the physicians who might otherwise undertake these tasks. Moreover, the training period for PAs is markedly shorter than those for physicians. Well, no, and we can't delete it either, right? Because then we have is markedly shorter than physicians. Well, then what of physicians, right? So we need to find what works grammatically right here. All right, well, we have moreover the training period for physicians' assistants. So we also want for physicians, right? Because we want to keep that parallelism. So we're going to want 4 and 4. So 4 and 4. So we can get rid of B. Now we're left with C, so we know C would be our answer, but we can also check that. And we have that for, and that makes sense, right? We have the training period for PAs is markedly shorter than, and then right here, we would insert training period if we weren't inputting that, right? So if we were to say the training period for physicians, and we were inputting something for the training period, we would input that, right? Because training period is singular. So we need the singular that, right? So we would have that for physicians. So we see that that'll be C. 2 to 3 years versus 7 to 11 required for physicians. Well, now that we've read through that paragraph, what we can do is we can go back and we can answer question 26. Question 26 asked us if we should insert a sentence at the beginning of that paragraph. So the sentence is, several factors argue in favor of such an expanded role. Well, everything in this paragraph was describing the factors that favor the expanded role of PAs, right? They can perform many jobs traditionally done by doctors. Although they're well compensated, they cost less than do physicians. And then we also had one more point below that. So we know we are going to want to place it there because it frames the point the paragraph will examine. It does not introduce a counter argument. So although, yes, we want to make the addition, that's the wrong reason why. So we're not going to do A. And then C and D, we do want to make the addition because it does frame the points that the paragraph will examine. And now from there, we've answered all the way up to 30, and now we can go ahead and start on 31. Physician assistants already offer vital primary care in many locations. Some 90,000 physician assistants were employed nationwide in 2012. Over and above their value and partially compensating for the general physician shortage has been their extraordinary contribution to rural health care. A recent review of the scholarly literature by Texas researchers found that PAs lend cost-efficient, widely appreciated services in underserved areas. All right, so when you see that we have underlined word beginning of the sentence followed by a comma, so we're looking for a transition word, right? All right, so we see our sentence before, we're talking about how PAs are cost-efficient and appreciated in underserved areas, such as rural areas, right? So rural areas, I'll rewrite that, right? So we have rural areas. So now we're told rural-based PAs often provide a broader spectrum of such services than do their urban and suburban counterparts, possibly as a consequence of the limited pool of rural-based physicians. All right, so is this on the other hand? No. Is this despite this? Despite of what, right? We're just making a statement before it, right? And we're also not saying that our sentence here is as a result of the sentence that precedes it up here. So now we're just left with in addition, right? Which makes sense because it's just in addition to being cost efficient, they also provide a broader spectrum of services, right? So they're cost efficient and additionally they provide a broader service. So our answer there is A. Increasingly, physician assistants and other such medical practitioners have become a critical complement to physicians. A 2013 RAND Corporation report estimates that while the number of primary care physicians will increasingly slow from 2010 to 2025, the number of physician assistants and nurse practitioners in primary care will grow at much faster rates. Now we're asked, should the writer include the following? In fact, according to the data presented in the table, physician assistants will likely outnumber physicians by 2025. Well, the first thing we want to know is this statement true, right? So will physician assistants outnumber physicians by 2025? So we find 2025 in our column, we find physicians in our row, and physician assistants. We see physician assistants, there are going to be 42,000, but there will be 216,000 physicians, so there should be more physicians than physician assistants. But we're saying physician assistants, there'll be more than physicians, which is backwards. So we know we're not going to add this because it's not actually correct, right? So our answer is going to be C, no, because it's not an accurate interpretation of the data. All right, so now we go back to reading. Both by merit and from necessity, PAs are likely to greet more patients. Well, that's the wrong patients, right? We're talking about the patients in a hospital, which is spelled like this, P-A-T-I-E-N-T-S, right? The patients that they wrote is when you wait for something, right? So they have the wrong patients, so we can get rid of any of them that have the wrong patients, right? So we can get rid of A and B. Now we see the difference between C and D is the type of than. We're looking for will greet more patients than ever before, right? With the comparative than. So the comparative is going to be than, spelled T-H-A-N. Then, spelled T-H-E-N, is when we're using a sequence of events, right? This happened, then that happened, right? So then would be a sequence, but than is comparative, which is what we're using here. So we know our answer there is going to be D. Gold into silver, the reverse alchemy of superhero comics history. So which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentences? All right, so we're just going to go ahead and read it, find our underlined sentences, and then go shortest to longest in order. Popular film franchises are often rebooted in an effort to make their characters and stories fresh and relevant for new audiences. Superhero comic books are periodically reworked to try to increase their appeal to contemporary readers. All right, well, what I see is that these two things are related and similar, right? It's just as the popular film franchises do this, the superhero comic books do that, right? So now I'm looking at my answer choices. I'm going to go smallest to largest in length. So I see that they're all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines for the most part, right? So any of them that are longer than 6, we can save for the end, but it looks like they are all 6. So now I just find the shortest last sentence, which is going to be in B. So I start with B. So we have just as popular film franchises are often rebooted in an effort to make their characters and stories fresh and relevant for new audiences, superhero comic books are periodically reworked to try to increase their appeal to contemporary readers. All right, well this, it gives us our relationship, right? It's showing that they're similar, right? So they're giving us that relatability that we wanted, right? But when they say just as popular film franchises, right? Now we're connecting the two ideas together. Additionally, everything is grammatically correct, right? Because we have our dependent clause up here with our just as popular film franchises all the way to our comma here. That's going to be our dependent clause. Then we have our independent clause here, right? Independent clause. With superhero comic books are periodically reworked to try to increase their appeal to contemporary readers. So we know B is going to be our answer there. So now we have this practice is almost as elderly as the medium itself. Well, we're not going to say the practice is elderly, right? Because that's not idiomatic. We wouldn't naturally put that in while we're writing. We would say this practice is almost as old as the medium itself. We would use elderly if we were describing someone. We're not going to use it here to describe the practice, right? We're going to use old for that. And has in large part established the ages that compose comic book history. The shift from the Golden to the Silver Age is probably the most successful example of publishers responding to changing times and tastes. Well, when we say the most successful example of publishers, we don't need any punctuation there, right? We're just saying it's the most successful example of publishers. We're not pausing here, right, to take a breath or anything. We're just going straight through. It's the most successful example of publishers. All of this belongs together, right? Most successful example of what? The example of publishers, right? This has to stay together. We don't want to split it up with any punctuation. It's an example of publishers. So we want to find one where it's not split up, right? So we can go ahead and get rid of B and A. So now we need to determine if we need a comma after publishers. So we read it again. The shift from the Golden to the Silver Age is probably the most successful example of publishers responding, right? So we have subject and then verb. We don't need a comma there. So our answer is going to be D. Right, now we have responding to changing times and tastes. The start of the first golden age of comic books is often dated to 1938 with the debut of Superman in Action Comics 1. Besides beginning the age, Superman in many respects defined it, becoming the model on which many later superheroes were based. His characterization, as established in Superman 1 in 1939, was relatively simple. He could hurdle skyscrapers, leap an eighth of a mile, run faster than a streamlined train, withstand anything less than a bursting shell, and lift a car over his head. And we're asked for an example consistent with the previous. Well, A is consistent with the previous, right? It's him doing things that a normal human can't do, right? Superhero type things. If we look at answers B, C, and D, they're all normal person things, right? So we wouldn't want those examples. We want the example that is heroic, right? So our answer there is going to be A. Sent to Earth from the doomed planet Krypton, he was raised by human foster parents whose love helped infuse him with an unapologetic desire to benefit mankind. Admirable but aloof, the Golden Age Superman was arguably more paragon than character, a problem only partially solved by giving him a human alter ego. Other Golden Age superheroes were similarly archetypal. Batman was a crime-fighting millionaire, Wonder Woman a warrior princess from a mythical island. By contrast, the second Silver Age of comics was marked by characters that, though somewhat simplistic by today's standards, now were asked for a choice effectively setting up the main idea of the following two sentences. Well, in order to know that choice, we have to know our main idea. So if we look, we have, in addition to supervillains, the new, soon-to-be iconic characters of the age, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and the Hulk among them, had to cope with mundane, real-life problems, including paying rent, dealing with family squabbles, facing anger, loneliness, and ostracism. Alright, so we're talking about real-life problems to these characters. So we look at our answer choices. We have, we're provided with origin stories, often involving scientific experiments gone wrong. Well, that's not what we're looking for. What about reflected the increasing conservatism of the United States in the 1950s? Well, it really doesn't have anything to do with politics. It's just them dealing with real-life problems. And then C, engaged in bizarre adventures? No. And then D, more realistic? Yep, because they're dealing with real-world problems, right? So more realistic than Golden Age counterparts. So our answer there is going to be D. Right. Now we have question 29. So we can see, in addition to supervillains, the new, soon-to-be iconic characters of the age, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and the Hulk among them, right? So we're doing a list of 3, and we see we have a dash here. Well, we know that we can put a dash after age to complete our non-essential list, right? Because if we take out Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Hulk among them, the sentence still works, so we know it's non-essential. We know we have our M dash there, so we also have to set it off with our M dash here, right? So our answer there is going to be D. Now we have their interior lives were richer and their motivations more complex, although sales remained strong for Golden Age stalwarts. Superman, and to a lesser extent Batman, now we're asked for a conclusion to the sentence and paragraph, logically completing a discussion of the Silver Age and providing an effective transition to the next paragraph. So we got to read the next paragraph. So we start, we come back. More transformations would take place in the medium as the Silver Age gave way to the Bronze Age and modern and possibly postmodern ages. Such efforts have yielded diminishing returns, right? And we can go ahead and answer 41. Such efforts is plural, right? So we need to have a plural verb, right? So such efforts have is going to be our plural form. They have yielded diminishing returns, right? We see that that is also consistent with our tense, right? Because if we look back, we can see such efforts have yielded diminishing returns, as even the complete relaunch of DC Comics line in 2011 has failed, right? So we're talking about present tense. So we're going to have the present tense and plural. Present plural would be have yielded. So our answer there is going to be A. Not would have yielded, not were yielding, and not will yield. Now if we go back, we can all go ahead and answer question 40, right? So if we look at question 40, we have to answer what concludes this sentence or this paragraph and also introduces our next one, right? Or transitions into our next one. So we want to end our discussion of the Silver Age. Well, question A, it doesn't show that we're ending our discussion of the Silver Age. Well, what about B? The distinctions between later stages of comic book history are less well defined? No, because in our next paragraph, we aren't really discussing the later stages being defined as ending in one date and starting in another, right? It's not like we're saying 1967 and then we began the next one in 1978, right? It's not like we're saying start to end. And then C, readers increasingly gravitated to the upstarts as the 1960s and the Silver Age drew to a close. All right, so we're talking about the Silver Age ending, right? So that fulfills one of our check marks because we want to complete our discussion of the Silver Age and provide a transition. So we're talking about readers gravitating to the upstarts in the 1960s, right? So the Silver Age characters, and then drawing the Silver Age to a close. So it's not the best transition into the next paragraph, I'll be honest. But at this point, we only have two answers left, so we're neutral on it, right? Because it failed one, and the other one, it's kind of iffy, right? But now we can look at D. We have these characters themselves underwent significant changes over the course of the Silver Age. Well, that's not going to complete our discussion of the Silver Age and provide an effective transition, right? The better choice to end our discussion of the Silver Age is up here in C, saying the Silver Age drew to a close. That's more direct, right? It's more efficient. So D, it also doesn't have a great transition in the next paragraph, but it doesn't really have one at all. So it has no transition. C has a neutral transition. It's not great, but it's there, right? And it also has a much better closing of the discussion of the Silver Age. So our answer is going to be C there. And the transition could have been stronger, but it is still present, although it is not fantastic in my opinion. So our answer there is going to be C. All right, so now we have question 42. So we have, as even the complete relaunch of DC Comics superheroes, well, we know superheroes doesn't own anything, right? So it's not possessive, so we can get rid of that there. So now we have DC Comics. Comics is plural, right? It's the name of the brand. So the brand name includes that S. So we need that apostrophe after the S. So now we look if we need a comma here. So we have such efforts have yielded diminishing returns as even the complete relaunch of DC Comics superheroes line in 2011 has failed to arrest the steep 2-decade decline of comic book sales. So we see that we don't need that comma there, right? It's all one thing. DC Comics superhero line. That should all be together. Right? It's all together. It's DC Comics superhero line. It doesn't have to be split up at all. So we go ahead and check. We get rid of everything with an apostrophe by that S of superheroes. So that's going to be A, B, and C. So just off that, if you knew that, you would know it had to be D. But it's also just good to know we don't need that comma at the end. So the answer is going to be D there. For both commercial and arguably creative reasons then, no transition was more successful than that from the Golden to Silver Age. And the reason I know it's that is because as I read, I see no transition was more successful. So I know transition is the word that I'm using here, right? And if I was to replace that with successful than, or no transition was more successful than that, right? Transition is singular, so transition singular. So we need our that to be singular. Those is plural, so those is plural. But since transition is singular, we know that that would be our singular pronoun there. So we know we're going to use that, which is going to be C for 44. We still have 43. So what we know is after reading both those pieces to this sentence, we see that for both commercial and arguably creative reasons, we're providing our reasons for our conclusion, which is that no transition was more successful than those from the Golden to Silver Age. So what we're doing is we're transitioning from our reasons to our conclusions, which means that then is a great transition to use, right? We're not going to use however because we're not contrasting. We're not going to use yet, and we're not going to use nevertheless. We're going to use then because it's showing the relationship, right? Because of these reasons, then it can be concluded that there's been no transition more successful than that from the Golden to Silver Age. Thank you for watching Preeminent Test Prep. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share as we will be releasing more videos to help you prepare for the SAT.